I am one of the few writers of my generation that can say I spoke to Doom. I had an opportunity early in my career in 2003 to speak to Doom, which in retrospect is tragic irony.
I think hip hop will always be a voice for the people.
Hey everybody, I'm Reggie Williams, founder and CEO of Ambrosia for Heads, and with me I have Jake Payne, our editor-in-chief, and together we are Ambrosia for Heads. Welcome to our What's the Headline podcast, first edition of 2021. Happy New Year to everyone. It is the beginning of a new year. I think a lot of people are looking forward to a better year. It's already started off with some craziness that we won't dive into because I'm sure everyone has heard, and we're going to keep it hip-hop today. But before we get too deep into 2021, we got to go back and talk about some of the things that happened in the last week of 2020. 2020 was a challenging year for all of us, and in the hip hop realm, got really, really crazy in that last week or so. We lost a few heroes. We lost Ecstasy from Houdini. We lost Shabba-Doo, also known as Ozone from Breaking, and we lost MF Doom. We're going to talk a lot today about those guys, particularly honing in on Doom, who's a huge favorite for the site, for our readers, for us. But yeah, we're going to kick it off. We're going to be thoughtful about our approach. There's been a lot about Doom out there, and we're just going to try and talk about it in a way that we think is relevant and celebratory, but also informative of the man who is so complicated. And meaningful to all of us. So let's start with the music. I first bought Operation Doomsday in 1999. It was a Fat Beats. It was either 1999 or early 2000. I lived literally down the streets from Fat Beats in New York. I lived at 15th and 6th, and Fat Beats was like on 8th and 6th, right above the Gray's Papayas joint. It was in the corner of like 8th and 6th. And, at the time I was running a site called newrules.com, which is really the precursor to AFH. And, there were some records, there's some releases that I wanted to get, but they weren't on CD or cassette or anything like that. So I got in a record player. One was Mountain Brothers, their album, I forget what it's called. They had
Cell Volume 1 or something?
Cell Volume 1. They had Galaxies and Paper Chase and a bunch of dope joints. I got People Under the Stairs and Operation Doomsday was another one that fell into that category. And you and I listened to an excellent podcast by John Carmonica of the New York Times featuring Stretch Armstrong, Bobbito, and Dante Ross. And Bobbito obviously had Fine One Records, which put out Operation Doomsday. And he said he'd only pressed up 2,500 copies, so now I'm feeling dumb for like not having my copy anymore.
I don't mean to correct you, but one thing I know about Cool Bob Love is he is a fact stickler. I think he said 4,500.
4,500.
Yeah.
I thought he said 20.
And it might be different vinyl versus CD, but I know what you got is very rare, and there's a lot of people walking around that say, "Yo, I got Operation Doomsday when it dropped," and nah, I'm gonna need to see receipts. So I believe you.
Yeah. But what was your first experience with Doom's music?
That's a really good question, and it's an answer that I can't necessarily place. I am 37, so I was 15, 16 years old when Operation Doomsday dropped. So I will tell you it was that. I can't front like, I was there for KMD and, had a bootleg copy of Black Bastards or anything like that. But it was right around, the Dead Bent singles and stuff like that. I was just consuming a lot of, 12-inch vinyl hip hop and remember learning of this guy. And it was in that ensuing year between 99 and 2000 that, somebody kind of really hit me to his story, which, 20 years later, I'm still learning things about. I think any Doom fan, especially in his passing, is still learning things that we didn't know about the author, the man.
Yeah. So I know you're a student of hip hop and have covered Doom extensively over the course of your career. Talk to me about what about his musical career, about like how he got his start, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I am one of the few writers of my generation that can say I spoke to Doom. I had an opportunity early in my career in 2003 to speak to Doom, which in retrospect is tragic irony, because the reason I spoke to Doom was a remix project had come out, kind of in the era when Ninth Wonder did like, his spin on, the Black Album, and a lot of great producers, Danger Mouse with the Beatles' White Album. There's a joint called Nostradamus, and it was basically taking Nas acapellas and placing them with, Doom Productions. So in 2003, which I know is a few years after Nostradamus had come out from Nas, I spoke to Doom, and I have it on tape. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to digitize it yet for today's conversation. But in a weird way, in 2003, I'm talking to Doom about Nas, which kind of answers your question in a weird way, because what's interesting about Doom and Nas, and Doom had told me that they had met in passing early in his career, but he didn't have a tremendous memory of it, is Doom and Nas are both derivatives of Third Bass in a way. Obviously, Search stepped in with Nas, helped him secure the deal at Columbia Sony with Faith Newman and everybody. But I think that Doom and KMD had a much deeper relationship with Third Bass. And I was actually, reading in my friend Brian Coleman's book, Check the Technique Volume 2, which I encourage any diehard hip hop fan to support those books. They're liner notes for a lot of classic albums throughout the eras. But Doom and MC Search go back to the mid 80s. Doom had bounced around New York City a lot with his family, originally born in the UK, in England, came to New York, had lived around Manhattan, Tribeca to be specific, Mount Vernon, I'm told, parts of Brooklyn. And then he had this Long Island, heritage too. And Doom and his brother Sub Rock spent a lot of their youth in Long Beach, which is a part of Long Island that borders Queens. And right there you had, Rockaway, Far Rockaway, which is where MC Search is from. So you had these two guys, and, they meet in the mid 80s, and then Doom kind of makes his break on The Gas Face by Third Bass. He's in the video. Prince Paul produced the track, and Don Newkirk, we had Paul and Newkirk on this podcast. Newkirk, of course, is dropping his game show host voice and introduces it to Doom, at the time known as Zev Love X from KMD. And through that association, through the success of that single, KMD lands a deal at Elektra, and by 91 puts out their first album, Mr. Hood, which I know, if I'm not mistaken, is an album you have a lot of appreciation for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, Doom's history, there is a decade plus before Operation Doomsday that ever happens. And what's really interesting too about the origin story, as I was digging, is Doom's first association with hip hop music began as a DJ. There's a really great interview that we supported on AFH that another fellow journalist, Peter Agustin, had done in 2003. And it's like an hour-long conversation with Doom. It's funny because it's a year before Food drops, but it's kind of as a lead up to that album, but also getting Doom's, time and thoughts over those last 3 years. And he talks about DJing in 3rd and 4th grade. So you got to figure, 9-10 years old. And what's so interesting is he was using some of his father's records and attending early hip hop block parties around New York. But he talks about hearing, really important records like Tom Tom Club, Genius of Love, which would have been a year or two or less old at the time, if you do the math the way I do it. And he heard those instrumentals, and at the same time was watching, classic records like Otis Redding's Tramp get played, joints that like Salt and Pepper would sample. So he has this vocabulary at a pre-adolescent age of, what's going on with hip hop, but also what's going on in terms of the sacred crates of hip hop. And then you have to look by the late 80s of like what New York DJs were doing with these blends, like Ron G and Kid Capri. And you can hear that style unravel itself on KMD's music and later Dooms. I mean, you look at one of KMD's biggest singles from the second album, Black Bastards, which came out before it was shelved. What a Brother Know is what I'll call it. And it's got a Jody Watley sample to it. So Doom spoke about, like, from this young age, he discovered that there's certain records that make the girls move, and there's certain records that make the hip hop heads, you know, or to gender it a little bit to make the dudes move. And he kind of incorporated that dichotomy throughout the music career that followed.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing. It was, you know, the beats like that, you know, like that Jody Watley beat and like, rhymes like dimes, and he's using Anita Baker, and like, you know, he had these soulful R&B tracks, but he's also got incredible wordplay that's appealing to the dudes. And in a lot of ways, you know, he's often juxtaposed against what was happening in the late 90s on the mainstream level, which was Bad Boy. And, you know, how polished that sound was, but they were often using a similar kind of formula. Because when you think about what Biggie did, or even like a Mace or someone like that, they had these classic like R&B samples from the 80s, you know, with like dope wordplay. But, you know, the sheen was a bit different on those Bad Boy joints. Doom kept it like gritty and dirty and chopped it up in a more, I don't want to say artistic because I don't want to be judgmental about it, but he chopped it up in a more complex way, whereas Puff just kind of like let the loop like play out. And it was received completely differently, you know. So, you know, and to your point about him starting off DJing and also graffiti because he was a very talented artist. I want to read a quote from that article you mentioned because he really wasn't even thinking about rapping. He thought about it more as kind of like a wordplay thing. So he had a quote. He said, "I didn't know it was going to be such a popular thing. It's something we used to do for a side hobby to keep your mind fresh. Word games. You might be walking down the street playing with words in your mind. So you throw them back and forth and words that rhyme just come to you. It's something we did as a hobby, like practicing thoughts, brain exercises, word searches and things like that, studying different languages where words come from." So, you know, he said he wasn't even really thinking about it as something to make money. It was just a way to kind of keep his mind fresh. And so it's amazing. And throughout his career, you know, obviously he used it as a means to support himself and his family. But it also seemed like he always put the art first.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And it's interesting, you know, in the Peter Agustin interview, he's talking a lot about the paintings, which, you know, the artwork, a lot of the Doom artwork that we saw over the years was things that he did, and everything was so deliberate. But also, I mean, and this is true to hip hop style, Doom has this quality of being very complex, but also being very effortless. You know, from what I've heard from Stretch and Bob and the John Caramanica podcast, you know, he wasn't somebody that did a lot of takes of songs, and joints like Dead Bent were actually mastered off of cassette. You know, Doom wasn't interested, and obviously there was a budget aspect too, but he had this same like graffiti writer's approach of, I got to get this done. I got to get this done in a finite amount of time. And it's really how it's going to be received above everything else.
Yeah. So why do you think he was received the way that he was? You know, tremendous underground following, you know, real dedicated hip hop heads, when he was using a similar formula to like that Bad Boy sound, but flipping it a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you said that because it's something I didn't realize at the time, and it's something that kind of jumped out at me over the last 2 weeks. But you're absolutely right. I mean, and it's funny because you know, Dead Ben is an Isaac Hayes sample. Jay-Z, you know, samples Isaac Hayes on Reasonable Doubt, but it's how they flipped it and what he does with that canvas. So it's almost like, you know, two different schools of thought are doing the same thing on two different frequencies. And, you know, that was such an exciting time, even though I wasn't, you know, I'm not like you. I didn't have Doomsday in my possession in '99, but I vividly remember, you know, you mentioned the Mountain Brothers, and I vividly remember the underground had something to say at that time. I mean, you know, obviously it had been around for years, but it was what this group of talented individuals that didn't have the means to do music videos, weren't getting play on a lot of radio, what were they doing with the same tools as Puff, Mace, Wyclef, Missy, so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, Doom was just really brilliant with that. And on top of it, you know, I mean, we're going to talk about The Mask, but you look at Slick Rick with the eye patch, you look at Flav with the clock. I mean, there are videos from Operation Doomsday, very low budget New York City kind of camcorder type joints, but Doom had this ability to create a vision of himself in the listener's mind. I mean, quite obviously, the, you know, even more than The Mask, he's creating characters. You know, we see that with you know, the artwork, you see that in the lines, you see that with the various samples from different, you know, comic, you know, shows and stuff like that. And then he took it and ran with it, obviously with Viktor Vaughn and King Geedorah and different stuff like that. But he made it, you know, really captivating for the listener at a time when, if you weren't doing that, you know, you're just another dope, you know, you're just another dope MC on wax or on CD. And he really launched himself off of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, you know, so just going back, you talk about that underground scene, and you're right. There have been a few, I think, um, surges of underground movements. You know, I'll say the first was probably in that 97, 98 period. You know, we had that, Ninth Wonder had done that post where he talked about the day that Nas's It Was Written was released, and the De La was it Stakes is High was
Stakes is
released.
high. Yeah.
And he attributes that as the first kind of like split in hip hop, because up until that point you listen to rap music, and you know whatever came out you listen to, and it wasn't like categorized in any particular way. Maybe there was East Coast and West Coast, but there wasn't this division between like mainstream and underground. But Nas, who had been part of what I think people would have considered underground at the time, because he was a, like ill lyricist and like had credibility from where he's from, the producers he was affiliated with, all those things, made in a lot of people's minds at that time a hard left in the polished sounds of like If I Ruled the World, and like you know,
Track Masters.
Ray and Track Masters and stuff like that. Then you got De La Soul with Dilla, and like you know, Common, and being like super gritty, but still doing it in a De La way. So it was the first kind of schism in hip hop. But in that John Carmonica interview, I believe it's Bobito, it's either Bobito or Dante Ross, who talks about how um, you know that really it really kind of blossomed in like 1999 or so, and that's when you got Raucous coming up. You've got, you know, Fat Beats was a real scene. Like you walk into Fat Beats and as a hip hop head, you felt like you were home. There were just records everywhere. It wasn't like a huge shop. You walked in, and to the left was like a DJ booth, and typically there was somebody spinning. Often it was Eclipse, who was the resident DJ there, but also who like curated and like you know, took care of the inventory and stuff like that. You had a wall in front of you with like kind of the new releases, and in the middle you had like almost an island. I'm trying to remember correctly, but an island of records where you find like the other stuff. And it was just a vibe, you know. It was up on the second floor, and it felt like a home. And I think it was the physical manifestation of the underground movement that was happening at the time. Another instance of the underground movement kind of like burgeoning was, I'd say, the 2006, 2007 era of like Blue in Exile, like you know, Below the Heavens.
Yeah.
I think that was a resurgence. And then the biggest, in my opinion, was like 2009 or so, with the emergence of J. Cole and Big Crit and Kendrick and Currency, and you know, all these guys who have now become, you know, huge superstars. And with the internet explosion and the ability to like download stuff and you know, playlisting and stuff like that, I think we're in an ongoing era of it. But in many ways, the beginning was that late 90s period, and that's when Doom kind of ascended. When you talk about his characters, there was a fantastic interview, and I'll try and remember to link it. Red Bull Music Academy. Chairman Mao talked to Doom for almost an hour and a half, and Doom broke down his philosophy of his characters. You know, he says that the reason why he used those characters is because he always thought of it like novels or films. He wanted to use different characters to convey complex storylines. And he thought that a lot of rap was just too straightforward and basic. He wanted to really convey dense stories, and the only way you can do that is through multiple characters. It can't just all be first person at one time. And so he broke down his characters, and first of all, he said Zev Love X was a character, from KMD, and we'll get to like Gasface and stuff in a minute. But a lot of people think that Doom was his initial character, and he went back and after like the tragedy that we'll talk about, created this to sin. But he says that actually all of his personas have been characters from the beginning, starting with Zev Love X. And he said that he and Subrock had already planned to do solo albums after Black Bastards, and he was going to be Doom, and Sub was going to be another character. And so he worked to develop the Doom character and make it distinctly different from the Zev Love X character. And in doing so, he had a different rhyme style and cadence and obviously demeanor and philosophy. And took it to Bobbito, and Bobbito got it when he heard it, and so wanted to sign him. So the way he describes Doom is Doom was the misunderstood villain. He was perceived as evil by the establishment, but had a heart of gold, and he calls him a Robin Hood type, someone for the people, but the establishment is always going to be against him. Victor Vaughn, he says, was similar, but he was younger. He was like an 18, 19-year-old, and he said whippersnapper, like a know-it-all kid who disagrees with Doom on a lot, but also looks up to him, so really like a younger brother. And for King Geedorah, he's from outer space. He says he channels info to Doom, gets the message to Doom. He's not on Earth. He said he's reptilian, 300-foot, three-headed dragon. And it's literally the Geedorah. I don't know, like if you, like, so when I was growing up, like they had the King Kong versus Godzilla films and stuff like that. And it was the special effects are like, it's almost like hand puppets, you know what I mean? Like, and Geedorah was one of the characters who fought Godzilla. So King Geedorah is a direct, derivative of that, just like Doom is a derivative of Marvel's Doom. So that's the way he described it. And he said the Zev Love X never disappeared. He was just in the background, and Doom always existed too. He was just waiting for his moment to appear. And he always considered it to be an ongoing story.
Mm-hmm. That's ill. I mean, yeah, you can hear how much television and comics meant to him, especially TV comics. Like in the conversation with Peter, and he down to the episode, and I've heard a lot of people that knew Doom say that he was just this sponge of information and had so many different influences. And it's wild to me too, even though he grew up all around New York, there's all these accounts of Doom in his teenage years cutting school and going into the city, which you have to imagine, mid 80s New York was just a playground of sights, sounds, and smells. And I love the way, especially on Operation Doomsday and the next 2 or 3 albums that followed, you can hear that feel, at least as I see it in documentaries and all of that, of grabbing from everything. And as we talk about the pain that Doom endured in the early and mid 90s, sometimes I think that like he captured a level of innocence that he found in his adolescence through TV, through hip hop, through comics, whatever, and held on to it and kind of surgically unraveled it in a way into his music career that allowed him to take solace in that. I know that's a giant leap, but I've listened to a lot of Doom in my life, especially over the last 2 weeks, and I've kind of come to that conclusion.
Yeah. So before Doom, there was obviously KMD. So let's talk about that a little bit. What was your take on? When did you get into KMD?
I got into KMD after. So Doom puts out Operation Doomsday on Fondle 'Em. Whether it's 2,500 or 4,500, they sell out. And the way that Bobbito describes it, it wasn't like hot off the presses, they're gone. when the pressings ran out, they shook hands. Doom kept his masters and kind of went off into that night. And I think to your point, around 99, 2000, you know, underground hip hop was thriving, especially overseas. So Doom was able to repress the album with other people as he did throughout his career, especially with that album. So in the early 2000s, 01, 02, he partners with Big Just of Company Flow and a friend of mine, Fiona Bloom, and they put it back out. They put Operation Doomsday on Subverse Music through Doom's Metal Face. And I don't know if you remember like Sandbox Automatic. Do you remember these like?
Yeah, of course. That was the Fat Beats e-commerce outlet. Yeah.
Right, you know, yeah. Smiley. Yeah, I mean there was, and so I was growing up in Pittsburgh, and around that time had moved to Philly. And I would buy a lot of the hip hop that I couldn't get in the stores that way. And there would always be like the illest promotions where if you bought this album, you'd get an autographed poster, you would get a 45, like tons of just Easter eggs. It was the ultimate fan experience, especially for a non-New Yorker. So anyway, I bought something that gave me, excuse me, a bootleg of Black Bastards, you know, or a re-release of it. So I heard Black Bastards before I heard Mr. Hood, which is an experience different than probably a lot of our listeners and probably you too, because I know you were of age in 91.
Yeah, but I didn't hear Black Bastards until like many, many years later, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, you heard Mr. Hood in the early 90s, right?
Yeah, I actually wasn't like, I didn't get into KMD until recently also.
Okay.
Well, recently I'd say 7-8 years or so.
Yeah.
And it was post Doom, you know.
Sure.
I went back and rediscovered his catalog. My first experience with KMD or with Zev Love X was Gasface.
Yeah.
That I experienced real time, you know, you know, that was ill to me. Like, and that was representative of the hip hop that I think was so influential on Doom. You know, a lot of people now compare KMD to, they say they were kind of like a natural extension to Native Tongues, especially with that De La sound with
Long Island.
Long Island, but the intricate use of samples, the use of a lot of dialogue from like, you know, 50s, 60s, 70s type like shows.
Probably the racial stuff too of like Black identity and what does it mean, and
but also doing so in a not in your face and a happy-go-lucky way, but just dropping in the gems. And so you know, Gasface, you know, with Third Base, was sonically like that, very much, you know, that kind of sample use and those kind of drums. It sounded, you could easily have put De La on that track and it would have sounded in place. So that was my first taste, and I didn't really connect the dots until later on, you know, but that was my first taste of KMD. But Black Bastards, you know, is definitely one of my favorites in their catalog. You know, I thought that album just sonically is amazing. You know, I know I sent you a song of the day yesterday from it. And, you know, that to me was, well, let's talk about like what happened with that album.
Well, if I can say something too, like, and I'm not disagreeing with you because I think we're going to agree on this, but, you know, to me, the hip hop underground, you know, really, you know, there's records that come out in the 80s. I, you know, again, my age, I didn't live it, but from what I've read and the experts I talked to, you look at like Ultramagnetic MCs and you look at a joint like Ego Trippin', and all that comes with Critical Beatdown, and that kind of paves the way to the underground. And there's other records, especially in New York, that come out, are influential to a lot of different folks and kind of build this community. But, you know, we're talking about Bobbito and Stretch Armstrong. I think their radio show, which, if I'm not mistaken, launched in 1990, was where the underground lived. And what's so interesting about that is, you know, they're there for the onset of KMD, you know, at least in terms of releasing records. And they're also there for the transition in 97 into Doom. But yeah, KMD comes out of that. And you wanted, I'm sorry, I just wanted to kind of get that point in.
Yeah, I want to talk about the controversy around Black Bastards. So that album ultimately became banned, and you know, I'll set the table because I actually did a paper on this, like in law school. I did a paper about like the controversy the music industry was facing. Back then, they were under intense pressure, by the moral majority, the Parental Music Resource Center, PMRC, led by Tipper Gore. They had been campaigning as early as like 1984 against Prince's Darling Nikki and things to like have music be rated. Just like films are rated, now TV is rated and things like that. They wanted to be a rating system for music because they thought that the explicit lyrics were harmful to children and they wanted to have a better way of identifying it for parents. And so fast forward to like the early 90s, companies like Warner Music are being sued. And this is like the Dolores Tucker, Calvin Butts era.
Yeah.
Because people are saying that gangster rap is like detrimental to kids. And Ice-T had just put out Cop Killer. Warner was under tremendous pressure because of that. They were a publicly traded company. And
Elektra is part of Warner,
Elektra's part of Warner, which is where KMD was signed. And so Warner at the time, like they drop Ice-T and Cop Killer, they drop Body Count. And Death Row, that's part of Death Row had also been on Warner in a Warner Music group
in the system, and then moved to.
They moved over to UMG again, part of that pressure. And so you're at a time where there's heightened sensitivity to everything. It's almost like now, like with social media, like in cancel culture. And KMD, well, you take it over from here. They have
so
album cover. Yeah, go ahead.
So KMD makes album called Black Bastards. Their first album, Mr. Hood, I was just reading in Brian Coleman's book. By accounts, it did sold somewhere between 130 and 150,000 copies, which is hard to do today. But I think that's important to say because it wasn't like KMD was this completely underground group. They were buzzing. The album did well. It didn't recoup, but from what I've read from Dante and other people, it had a higher budget. Sylvia Rhone, Elektra, that whole team, they said, hey, we'll give you another album. So they started making this album on a $200,000 budget, which by 1993 standards was not a ton of money. But, they record it in a whole bunch of different places. Pete Nice from Third Base is managing the group at the time, kind of getting them into studios, doing things like that. They make this album. And, thematically, because now we can listen to it. It's on DSPs. It's been released. There's a lot of content that deals with racism and Black identity on that album. On top of it, KMD since the early 90s, since their single artwork and promo photos and stuff like that, they use the Sambo character, which is obviously repurposing a racist cartoon from the 1920s, 1930s. I don't know the exact years that, of Sambo, but they kind of made it their own, which is not unlike what Basquiat did. I mean, his graffiti tag was Samo, which was a play on that as well. I mean, this is kind of like taking something negative and flipping it. And as the album is, at 98% done, tragedy strikes. So on April 23rd, 1993, Sub Rock.
Well, even before that, so the cover is not just the Sambo character, but in a noose, like hanging, and
true.
There are executives at Warner, at Elektra, specifically the label, which is an affiliate or a subdivision of Warner Music.
Mm-hmm.
There are executives, many of whom are Black, who are offended by the cover, and Dante is trying to defend it. He gets opportunity with Doom to go and kind of like explain the vision for it, but ultimately they decide that they're not going to put the album out.
Yeah, and from what I've read, a big pressure in that situation was a Billboard article in '94 from Havelock Nelson.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's why I started to talk about what was happening in '93. But you're absolutely right. Yeah. Ultimately, the album doesn't come out. The single that we had mentioned earlier, "What a Brother Know," had a video, came out. I don't think it caught on fire, so to speak. But Doom, in a really rare move, in '94, walks out of the Warner building. I think literally, from what I've read, with the album in his possession.
Yeah, with his masters
and a paycheck.
Right. So, while this is happening, you were saying.
I mean, it's important to note, and I didn't realize that there was a year difference between these two things happening. April 23rd, 93 is what Brian Coleman's book says. Sub Rock, 19 years old at the time, is crossing the Long Island Expressway and is struck by a car and killed. And that year, in the weeks and months leading up to it, both Doom, Zev Love X, Daniel Dumal, and Sub Rock had each become fathers. Doom is 2 years older than Sub Rock, and it's interesting. For a lot of years, one of the misnomers you'll hear is that they were twins. There's a story of their resemblance being one of the impetuses of Doom wearing the mask. They're actually not twins. They're 2 years apart, but from all accounts, from Third Base, from Dante, different people, they had a striking resemblance, and they had an otherworldly chemistry where they could finish each other's sentences, and these guys were as close as two brothers can be. So this happens, and from what I've heard Doom say on the matter, not only is he a young father, he is taking a responsibility and a role in Sub's daughter's life. So this is all happening as they're recording an album on a shoestring budget. Fast forward a few months and the album doesn't even come out. So it is blow after blow after blow. And Doom has been, had been very honest in interviews, and the few that he did, that financially, even though he left Elektra with a check and with his album, I mean, he's used the word homeless numerous times. And I don't take that lightly. I think that Doom was extremely hard up by 94. And I can't imagine the pressure of having that happen, and on top of it being a new parent and helping a grieving part of your family.
Yeah, so just in a matter of years, in a matter of like 5 years, because I think Gasface came out like 89. Gasface is their first record, first time they've ever been heard publicly. They parlay that into a record deal, have 2 albums as KMD, sitting on an album that they're incredibly proud of, which is full of social commentary, sonically incredible. Brother dies, get dropped from the label, can't put the album out, and financially in really, really dire straits at this point. So now we're in like 95, 94, 95 or so, and Doom really kind of like falls into the background, kind of like falls off.
Yeah, I mean, and there's different accounts. People like to correct that he didn't really disappear, but he bounces between, New York, Atlanta, Virginia, kind of just living. And Doom's described it as, he described coming back to New York 96, 97, apparently in Freeport, Long Island, and Doom said, I was damn near homeless, kind of a no shower sort of situation. So, picture a flop house, somebody's couch, whatever. And he said, but I had a lot of time. So this guy, this creative, brilliant mind, is sitting around listening to tons of jazz radio, probably like an AM frequency, and just living life, probably a very simple life, and making trips into the city and reconnecting with some of the figures that had been there for him during the KMD years, which I think, really Stretch and Bob are key parts of that.
Yeah.
Stretch.
So
go ahead.
Stretch and Bob.
Yeah.
So if you're in New York at that time in the 90s, they're on the Columbia radio station. I'm forgetting to call it.
KCR, right?
KCR, yeah. And they have a show on from like, I think it's like 1 in the morning to 5 in the morning. So you got to be super dedicated, super devoted. But a lot of pause tapes were made. Like incredible pause tapes were made. For a lot of people, they know it. One of the biggest things to come off of that is the Jay-Z Big L freestyle session. But I mean, it's the home to so many things. And, Stretch and Bob have put out a documentary which lays out that history. Is inspirational, it's informative, it's historical. But they are unquestionably kind of the gatekeepers for underground hip hop. And in a lot of ways, all of hip hop, because a lot of people who got their start there ended up becoming some of the biggest stars on the planet. Nas, Eminem, Jay-Z,
Biggie.
It goes on, Biggie, it goes on and on. But Stretch and Bob, become key players in Doom's ascension separately. So yeah, so you take it over from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, because as you know from the documentary, these guys were kind of drifting apart by the late 90s, different tastes in music. Stretch, produces on Little Kim's hardcore album, if I'm not mistaken. They're not always together, but Doom goes to Stretch, who has this house somewhere in New York, apartment filled with records. And they had enough kinship, and I really liked what Stretch told John Caramanica of, like, he knew that this guy was hard up and like maybe just needed a place to chill. But Doom shows up with a sampler, has access to all of these records, and begins making a lot of the sketches of what became Doomsday. And Stretch describes, because I mean, he was a top club DJ at the time, coming in at 5 a.m. and seeing Daniel Dumile, half asleep or snoring at the MP or whatever the machine he had, going through records. And what Stretch said is so interesting is, I had all of these records, and what Doom gravitated towards for Doomsday wasn't the digging in the crates, like, yo, let me find this super obscure like loop or snare or something. He was grabbing a lot of DJ records, Steely Dan, the scratches from, Scott LaRock scratches on Poetry, I believe. And,
Jones, like, 5100
Sade,
yeah.
Atlantic Star, just like crazy. But again, it speaks to that, genesis of those parties and Doom's, sensibilities musically. So whatever he takes, he ends up, leaving Stretches after kind of having safe harbor there. And Dead Bent, which is, from what I understand, the first song Doom recorded that would make Doomsday, gets play on Stretch and Bob's show. And Bob in particular takes so much interest in it that he offers to put it out. He had created Fondulum Records, which you mentioned Raucous. I think Fondulum is such an important label. You've got the Juggernauts, Megahertz, Cenobites, which he had already put out, which was Cool Keith and Godfather Don's side project, and he offers him an opportunity to put this music out, which Doom accepts. So you're absolutely right, with both of those guys, it created the platform to truly and literally reinvent himself.
Yeah, so they press up the copies, all vinyl, like keeping it super purist. Album sells out, does reasonably well, but they don't repress it. But it's the thing that like kind of launches Doom into the atmosphere, and it's the beginning of what will become one of the most I think complex, purely artistic careers that we have seen in hip hop. Doom is now liberated. You hear a lot of talk about how Doom would kind of like sketch the framework for songs, and Sub Rock would come in and polish it and finish it up. But Doom is now liberated to just do what Doom does, and like a lot of like celebrated. It's interesting to me that like the people who kind of endure or like have like a heightened reverence are the ones who aren't slaves to like the polish. You hear about like a Dilla, Madlib, like and Doom is free to like just make music the way that he feels he should make it. He said in that interview too, the Red Bull with Chairman Mao, that he likes to keep his samples. He likes to keep his samples as simple as possible to keep it as close to the actual record as possible, even though he's chopping it differently and everything. He doesn't want to put effects and polish on it to make it sound different. And so he's able to do that with his songs, and and using this Doom character.
Well, what's so interesting too is that album. People praise its production, and obviously there's some really clever rhyme schemes on it. But it is, this term therapy is turned into such a cliche about people's albums, but it's truly therapeutic. You look at the track Doomsday, or the track Just a Question Mark, which there was a video for, and he's addressing the loss of his brother. He in places is seeming to touch on being rejected by the industry and coming back. it's like, yeah, it's just a phenomenal artistic interpretation of a really rough 5 years.
Yeah, yeah, and part of what makes him so appealing is the complexity of his rhyme style. And it's complex because it's complex for as much as he doesn't do as what he does do. A lot of times, and he talks about this, he'll fill in a word, and it'll be, you think the word, you're gonna know the word, but it'll be something expected, and it'll be after a pause, or like it'll be like a beat later. And he just had a really unorthodox rhyme style, that was, in a lot of ways, like jazz. Like jazz is appealing because it breaks the traditional scales, but it's still part of the scale, but it approaches the scale in different ways. I'm not explaining that as artfully
I
as I
know exactly
want
what
to.
you mean, though. Yeah.
Yeah, and Doom does the same thing. Like, the human ear, we like repetition, but we like modifications to the within the framework of that repetition, like that. Like, it's like ear candy. There's a lot of music theory involved with it, and his rhyme style kind of fits that music theory.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much improvisation and surprise. You're absolutely right. You'll listen to a Doom line and you expect it to be one thing, and he knows you do, and he hits you with another. And then also just the compound schemes of, where he would take a bar and it would just hit it 3 or 4 different times, like pinball, with the rhyme. And his references were so succinct to the music. You know what I mean? Like, Doom grabbed from a certain type of like 1970s to early 90s culture, and he kept that in his punchlines and his similes, all of that. And it just, yeah. And also, I mean, you and I spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about MCs with great voices. And it's wild to watch Doom's voice change from KMD. Like, you hear it, but whereas Mr. Hood has kind of this like teenage innocence and this joy about it, you get into Black Bastards and it's a little bit more cynical, and you can hear it. And by the time you get to Doomsday and beyond, it's got a gruffness. Like, clearly this is somebody who's lived life in a way that probably not everyone has.
And sonically, he puts together collages. He uses a lot of vocal effects from cartoons and like old TV shows to convey messages. We talked about the juxtaposition between the R&B samples and his gruff, like super complicated dense rhymes. He talks in the Red Bull interview about like there was a 1980s like radio show, and if you start to think about things like the Adventures of Grandmaster Flash and the Wheels of Steel and the collages that Flash uses, that was a staple of hip hop, to kind of have these like random like vocals and things like that over like different like beats and things like that. That was the inspiration for his entire production style. And so he uses this throughout throughout his career. He produced the vast majority, I think all of like Operation Doomsday, and much of his material going forward. Of his solo catalog, what's your favorite album?
Doomsday. It's just the world I want to live in,
Yeah, yeah.
And that's truly, of all of Doom's catalog, I feel that way about that album. Yeah.
Yeah. I love Doomsday. It's probably a tie for me in the solo stuff between Doomsday and Food.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I love that album too. But we'd be remiss in talking about Doom and not talking about the collabo albums that he had, because he had a ton of collabo albums too that helped to round out his catalog. So I know you're well steeped in these, so why don't you break down some of those collabos?
Yeah, I mean, even before the albums, I mean, out of that world of reinvention, Doom brought a class with him. I love the fact that he's created this universe, but sort of like The Simpsons or any good comic book. I'm not a comic book head. There's other characters. And I mean, out of it, you've got MF Grimm, you've got Count Basie, you've got, Bob, gets on wax and does what he does. And Signs of Life, there's on and on and on. But from what I understand of Doom is he had this network of, and I heard a lot of people, even around the time that I spoke to Doom, that he was this guy, you could only really reach him by phone, even in the early 2000s, wasn't like an email guy. And you hear that in some of the interviews of just like who he was communicating with, who was checking in on him. But he was also, not a businessman, but Sean Price was like this too. Doom was about his hustle. And I feel like after the success of Doomsday, of course, there were opportunities to repress the album, but then there were all these labels that wanted to be in the MF Doom business. And I don't know if it was the characters or it was a necessity out of contract or whatever, but he starts coming with these different projects like, we started to talk about, but, very early on, obviously the biggest one is Madvillain, which, you brought to my attention. I had forgotten that up until that point, Doom and Madlib had not met each other, right?
Yeah, that's what. Yeah. He had not met Madlib before that. In fact, he didn't even know about Madlib.
Yeah.
It was Peanut Butter Wolf from Stone's Throw Records who connected the two of them and suggested that they work together. And so Doom came out to California.
Like 2 weeks or something, right?
Yeah, and Madlib had this house, supposedly a really incredible place. It was like a mansion, several rooms, and Doom says that even though they were together in the same physical space, they were rarely in the same room. Typically, Madlib would make the beat, or Doom would be working on something, and Doom would be listening to it, and going over the rhyme schemes in his head in a separate room, and then they would come together and record in a room that was described as like a legit bomb shelter, like no windows, like fortified walls, the whole nine, and they're making these bombs inside the bomb shelter. But he and Madvillain rarely communicated outside of that, even in the same space. And in the work they did subsequent to that, it was the same thing. Where, but he said they also had a mind meld. They were on the same frequency, and even though they weren't communicating directly, they understood exactly where each other was coming from.
It's probably like that jazz thing you're talking about too, especially, Madlib is a jazz musician, in my opinion, especially coming off of his father, that they would communicate that way.
Yeah. And so out of that came Madvillain, which I think is one of the most acclaimed Doom projects of all of his entire catalog. One of my favorites too. It's up there
For sure.
with the other two with me.
Our readers love it. Yeah, and I mentioned, when I mentioned that cast of characters, a lot of those guys, appeared on the Monster Island Czars album, which was a side project in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, that Doom put out, which, true to form, was everyone had an alias, but it was his group, his community at the time. I think Grimm really played and Grimm has his own crazy story and kind of came up under Cool G Rap for a time, and allegedly was around the death row scene. But these two kind of industry misfits lead the way on this album. Doom supplied a lot of the beats. That's an album that I've seen people talk about, over the last 2 weeks. But yeah, I mean, he just kind of goes label to label, team to team, and makes these collabos. Madvillainy being huge, and then he follows that up with Danger Doom, linking up with Danger Mouse. And I don't hear that project come up a lot. I really liked it. I think I reviewed it at the time, and that was at a time when Danger Mouse was making headlines for the Gray album. But what people forget is Danger Mouse is a producer that grabbed a lot of talented MCs that have been maybe overlooked. Like, he's done a lot of stuff with the Artifacts, Gemini the Gifted One, and he was somebody who had worked with Doom, I think, bringing him into his own albums, and they had a solid enough rapport to go and do that. And if I'm not mistaken, that's that album the Cartoon Network Adult Swim folks got involved in too.
Yeah, and there was a complex story with that. I know you dug a lot into that, so you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, and that, I'm not a comic book head, but I remember at that time watching Cartoon Network and Adult Swim, with friends, and they were really letting in different ways that they were down with hip hop. And I mean, that same group, has a lot to do with the formation of Run the Jewels, and Killer Mike's R.I.P. album. But, they had kind of commissioned this project, Danger Mouse producing, Doom rhyming. And yeah, I mean, it did really well at the time. I think Doom had this snowball effect by 03, 04, where all of a sudden, you know, people that were not hip hop heads were coming up to me talking about Doom. I mean, he had a true cult following that just still was building in real time. And, you know, we'll talk about unreleased recordings in a minute, but that relationship ultimately led to Adult Swim cutting a check, allegedly for 45 grand, to Doom of, hey, come back and make a solo album with us. And the beautiful thing is we have the rights to a lot of the cartoon stuff that you might want to sample. And we can speak a little bit to the mystique of Doom as we go, but kind of takes the check and goes gently into that good night.
Take the money and run. Yeah.
Word to Steve Miller. Yeah.
Yeah. OK Player did an interview with Jason DeMarco, the senior vice president, creative director of Adult Swim. Excellent read. But yeah, he talks about that and how he loved Doom and his artistry and his creativity, but it was also that creativity and that mercurial nature that like made it very difficult to work with him on a business level. You know, he talked about that. There's a traditional stuff of like, you know, being hard to kind of pin down times, like he'd show up and be a few hours late and things like that. But the bigger issue was, as you said, like not actually getting what they paid for, you know. And you know, on top of that, they had that series, was it Pocketbook Rhymes?
Yeah, Rhyme Book or something.
Yeah.
More recently, that was in like
missing Notebook Rhymes. They had
yes.
a Missing Notebook Rhymes series, and yeah, there was a song that was just released from Doom, just like there's an Adult Swim joint just like a month or so ago, which was amazing, but not available on DSPs. We talked about it in a prior podcast.
Yeah, with Flying Lotus, right?
Yeah, and and Thundercat, and part of it is that you know, they had this series they were doing with him, you know, as a way to kind of salvage that deal, I suppose. But they started getting in legal trouble because they would get a song, they put it out, and then all of a sudden, like people be coming out of the woodwork saying, "Hey, that's our song.
Yeah.
Why are you putting it out?" And so Doom was just he was being a villain in terms of like the business practices.
Well, and I mean, over the last 20 years, especially as technology evolved, you and I saw that with Ambrosia for Heads. I mean, we would post a song and within hours it would get taken down on SoundCloud or YouTube, or, you know, there was a Doom performance at South by Southwest and everybody tripped and was like, oh, this is new music. And every time we touched something with Doom, people that still remain close to him, you know, would reach out to me with some corrections or be like, yo, take that down, you know. And it made a headache in its time, but I know the fans loved it. But yeah, Doom, I think that he took a lot of deals. And there was even, you know, on the Danger Doom album, Ghostface Killah appears on a joint called The Mask, which is really good, you know, one of my favorites from that album. And, you know, Ghost ends up picking some Doom joints on, I believe, the Fishscale album. And out of that, at the time, they did a Mass Appeal magazine cover together. Phenomenal, you know, like up there with Mass Appeal had Nas and Large Professor years later together. Just a phenomenal era of art direction. But, you know, they were supposed to come with an album, Doomstarks, that lived in infamy for years and years and years. And at one point, I had read a trusted source, these are Billboard, MTV, the like, that in one of his last, you know, years at Def Jam, that Jay-Z, you know, had picked that album. He had budgeted it because Ghost was already at Def Jam. And Doom, I mean, even when Nas made his Untitled album, he wanted to work with Doom. You started to have these A-list artists that were, you know, recognizing the talent, both as a producer and as an MC, and trying to bring him into the fold.
Yeah, you know, often when an artist passes away, there is music rumored to be in the vaults that people clamor for. We've seen a tremendous amount of output from Prince over the last couple of years.
Tupac
a ton. A bunch of Sean Price music. The new Five Dog album is coming supposedly in the next few weeks. With Doom, it sounds like there's a lot of stuff out there. There may be complications legally. We're going back to Madvillainy. during that session, and I'm not sure if it's subsequently, but Doom says that they recorded 3 to 4 albums worth of material. In fact, in an interview with Spin Magazine, which we covered on AFH by Will Gotzgen, Doom said if you heard them back to back, it would sound like both of them are interchangeable with Madvillainy. And all 3 of them, there's actually 3 or 4 of them by now. So it sounds like there's a whole series of like Madvillain albums, which which come out like under the right circumstances.
Yeah, I'd heard grumblings over the last year, that Doom was doing things at a high level, and I personally don't, he obviously did stuff with Gennaro Jarrell, if I'm saying that correctly, and Bishop Nehru. Like Doom, every 3 or 5 years he finds a new like tribe, and Doom did a really cool job kind of knighting a new group of MCs and producers. Last year he worked with Your Old Droog, who I know you can just hear the influence of Doom in him. But I had heard, that Doom was making moves with some goats. And I also had been hearing from, people that we finally would see a follow-up to Madvillainy. And obviously since that album released, Madvillain and Peanut Butter Wolf have parted ways. There's probably a lot of red tape involved in that project, but similar to what's happened with Dilla. And it's so sad that you have, 2 guys that work so closely with Madlib both passed away way too young. But I hope, that art finds its way to the light so long as, it's ready for public consumption, which by what you read, Doom acted like it was ready to go.
Yeah. And, because his production style was so raw, like, probably wouldn't need that much polishing in it because he probably would intend it to come out that way, so.
Yeah, and luckily, I mean, on the production side, I think Doom did 1 joint on Madvillainy. Madlib did the rest. They kind of did a Pete and CL flip, like the creator. But I would have to assume that, with Madlib still being here, and Madlib is, not I guess, yeah, you could say a perfectionist, even if he kind of operates on his own science. But luckily, he's here to make whatever tweaks on the music side would need to be made.
Yeah, and so we know that the missing notebook rhymes songs that were taken down are still out there. Potentially they were parts of other projects that have been unreleased. In watching that Chairman Mao interview, Doom said he had it, and this is back in, I think, 2015. Back then, Doom said he had a diss record in the works where Viktor Vaughn was going to be going at Doom. So, maybe that's out there, but, certainly the hope that, with this huge loss, his legacy will continue to live on through new music.
Yeah, when the Missing Rhyme Book series, he revived KMD, and it was, I think, at that particular track, if I'm not mistaken, it was Pulled was just Doom, but throughout the years, he had talked about bringing back that group, and obviously Sub Rock has passed, and in the conversation he had with Peter in 2003, he talked about Little Cy from Signs of Life, who people I think better know as John Robinson joining the fold. And I got to know John over the years, and he was one of the people, for a lot of years, Doom was in Atlanta, somewhere in the late 90s, early 2000s, he relocated. And it's funny, he talks about why Atlanta was attractive to him. I think he could be off the grid. And obviously, people like Eric Sermon, Too Short, Atlanta has a history of being DJ drama, where hip hop artists go. I think the quality of life in many ways, not just financially, can be a little bit better. But one of the things, that I have to say that's so interesting is over the last 2 weeks, I've tried to give people their space. But some of my friends over the years that were close to Doom, we've just been in touch with each other, checking in. And I'm amazed that so many people that had done work with Doom and known him far better than I can ever say I did, or most, still are in a shroud of mystery. Was he living overseas? Was he down in Atlanta? Was he doing this? Was he doing that? I mean, obviously people know the whole, imposter of sending other people on stage and stuff even beyond the stage that Doom was doing. But I kind of for a guy who liked characters and narrative so much, somehow it's like a bit appropriate that we're left with such great music and still quite a few questions.
Yeah, I think he embedded a lot in his art. You could hear that pain. You could hear like, what his philosophy was. He talked about that a lot, but he was also intensely private. Like, that's even in the announcement. We didn't even know that he passed away until
2 months.
yeah, 2 months after the fact. He died on Halloween, and we didn't hear about it until December 31st. And so that's representative of who he was. There's a couple things. I want to read a quote from him about his rhyme style, and then and then also something that he was saying as advice and a question. So in his rhyme style, he said, "I ain't gonna be talking shit about the next dude or bragging about shit I got. I talk broke shit. I talk about shit I don't got, or things I'm striving for. Say you're speaking from a point of view where you're talking to yourself in maybe a sad mood. How do your tones come across? How can people feel what you're saying? Can they hear what you're saying? Are you well pronounced? Maybe you purposefully were a little bit sloppy with it to bring the point across. Can you bring the point across and still get the rhyme points? It's like gymnastics on paper." And then that's how he approached his rhyme style. Like, he was very much a word technician and a craftsman. But in listening to him, in those Red Bull sessions, they always open it up for Q&A afterwards. And someone asked him for advice on, moving forward in their career. And he just had these three words: follow your heart. He's a guy who clearly, followed his own muse and was true to his own artistic intent. And you can tell from the outpouring of love and respect and the pain that we saw, like in our Facebook community, Instagram, and like all over the hip hop universe, that this guy, even though he wasn't the biggest selling artist, was clearly one of the most influential artists of the last 20 years. And that's a legacy that will endure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the outpouring of love. I feel that 2021 began with a cloud for a lot of people, and even before the events this week. And I feel that Doom is that cloud. And I know Spotify told me in 2018 that my most listened to artist was Madvillain. I don't remember it that way, but I can still say that to say I've listened to more Doom in the last week and a half, and KMD and Third Base and all of the family tree than I have in a long time, and my appreciation just continues to build.
Word. So, as we said at the top, Doom was not the only loss that week. We lost John Fletcher, who is better known as Ecstasy of Houdini. Houdini was incredibly important to me. I remember buying the Escape cassette in San Francisco. I think it was 1983 when it dropped, in Tower Records. Actually, it was in Los Angeles in Tower Records. It's the first time I've been at the any Tower Records, and to go to that one in LA was incredible. And Houdini was one of my favorite artists back then. Run DMC obviously were incredible. When we talk about polish, Houdini were like the polish side, pristine production, synthesizers, like big R&B. But Ecstasy was that dude who, like, as soon as he just started spitting, like, his voice just penetrated and cut through. Like 5 Minutes of Funk and Freaks Come Out at Night, and it's like Friends. Like, he was that, like, you just felt his voice when it came out, and so for me, that was a huge loss. Not that old. And then same thing for Shabba-Doo, also known as Ozone. I remember seeing Breaking in the theater when it came out, and literally I made a pact with myself, and I kept this up for probably about 20 years to watch Breaking at least once a year, every year. So I've seen Breaking probably like 40, 50 times. And Turbo, Boogaloo Shrimp, Michael Boogaloo Shrimp Chambers, is the one who often gets a lot of the love because his ticking and Boogaloo was just like unbelievable. That broom scene is still one that like gets people riled up, and to lose Shabba-Doo in a year or 6 months before breaking is going to hit the Olympics is like a real tragedy because he's a guy who uh, more than almost anyone helped to put it on the mainstream's radar, and popularize it and make it a global thing. There's a documentary out there called Breaking and Entering. It's before Breaking, and it features all of the players in Breaking. Shabba-Doo, um, Boogaloo Shrimp, Ice T is in it prominently.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because Ice T is talking a lot about like doing things for the community and like so upstanding and like how there's too many detrimental messages out there and everything. It's wild to
Yeah.
see in contrast to like what his rap became. But it's you can see it on YouTube. It's a great look, and there's this one part where Shabba-Doo, comes and he explains how to like lock and everything, and like he breaks down that like it came from the Soul Train dancer in this episode and so forth. He went on to choreograph for lots of people. I think he danced with Janet Jackson and Donna. Just a real talent, man. So big losses for hip hop, but again, man, these artists, all of them, have lots of recorded material that will preserve their legacy and influence people from multiple generations.
Yeah, and I mean that's the one bittersweet part out of it is, hopefully there's greater attention. I think that we're living in a time of just content, and it's not until somebody's not making content anymore that we can sometimes stop and really appreciate. And I think that applies across mediums. And um, yeah, I didn't live through the Houdini era, but that one struck me because I often think Houdini goes unsung for their Brooklyn history. I always think that Larry Smith is one of the goats of production that is often forgotten, and he supplied a lot of their music, the songs that we remember. And I actually went to college with Ecstasy's daughter. I didn't know her, but my best friend did and does. And yeah, just really sad to hear that. And one of the things I'm proud of, not to make it about us, but with the AFH legacy, is when we did finding the GOAT MC, by virtue of having your hip hop experience, outside of the group, we had Ecstasy in there,
Yeah.
as and you know I love De La Soul, and I often feel that Dave and Pos are overlooked because they're really guys connected to a group that never really went off on their own too much. And certainly true of Houdini too, because a lot of people know Houdini but don't know the name Ecstasy. And I hope out of the ensuing tributes and recognition that people really see what a pioneer he was. And there was a lot of talent under that hat.
Yeah, I mean, beyond the musical influence directly, Houdini, you go back and look at that Freaks Come at Night, Freaks Come Out at Night video, and you'll see UTFO like as their background dancers, and young Jermaine Dupri is in there too.
Yeah.
They had a lot of impact, man. So yeah, rest in peace to all these folks that we lost. We had a scare this week too. Dr. Dre had a brain aneurysm, and those who remember, for me, I was nervous because it was eerily similar to like um, um, the John, oh man, why did I just lose his name? The John Singleton
Yeah.
situation where
Yeah.
John had a stroke and seemed to be okay, and then like hours later passed away. But so far, it seems like Dre is okay. He made a statement from the hospital. And so it seems like but like just a reminder, man, you just never know. And so it's one of the things I love about Drink Champs and wanting to celebrate people while they're here and give them their flowers. And I think that Dr. Dre has certainly received his share of acclaim, publicly and privately, I'm sure. But yeah, that was a scary one too. So,
Yeah, absolutely. When Yeah, when I saw that on Monday, yeah, I'm still very much reeling from, the other passings. And it's weird. When my grandmother passed away, I didn't feel it at first. And then weeks later, it hit me. And, the news of doom obviously was on New Year's Eve. And it changed the tone of the rest of my day. I got a text from our friend Richie at Rhymesayers. But I have to say that, here we are more than a week later. I've felt it more in the last 3 or 4 days than I did initially. And yeah, I hope 2021 is a year of positivity and good health for all, but especially in the hip hop community, because it's been a hard few weeks.
Yeah, I think so, man. Despite all the craziness of the week, I feel positive. I feel optimistic, and yeah. So, um, one other thing I want to touch on, just on the new music tip. So Griselda released a project. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, you and I a few months back, Griselda's moving into film. I think kind of following the No Limit, Who Bangin', 3 6 Mafia, like that 90s when rappers would get together and make a movie that wasn't trying to win any Oscars, but was trying to build an extension of their musical movement and hopefully put a few talented individuals on. People forget that Kevin Hart, one of his first film appearances was, in a Dame Dash movie, Paper Soldiers, I think. But yeah, Griselda's keeping that tradition alive, and they've made a film called Conflicted, which I believe drops next week, but they released the soundtrack a week early. It's got all the usual suspects with Griselda, Benny, Conway, Gunn, Amani Caesar. But they also tapped a few of, the affiliates in their circle. Ransom, who folks may remember, from his association with Stack Bundles and Joe Budden. Ransom had an incredible 2020, releasing very DIY albums, like a series of them. And he was one of the artists that I think folks criticized AFH, you and I, for not putting in our year-end list. And I listened to a lot of Ransom this year. It's dope to see him on there. Lloyd Banks is on there. It's not Derringer production, but Lloyd on his own. And a lot of people have said that Lloyd would be a really good addition to Griselda, sort of like what Boldy James was last year. So maybe more on that to come. And my favorite joint on there is it's got Smoke DZA and Wale on it. And the name I'm going to tell you right now is because it's on the tip of my. It's called The Hurt Business with Gunn, DZA, and Wale. And just Camouflage Monk produced the beat, and he's been working with them for years. And that's just the joint. So we'll have to check out the movie because maybe it's great too.
Right. All right. So cool, man. So song of the week.
Man, I'm gonna give it up to KMD. You told me before we started taping that my voice sounded like I was hungover, so I'm gonna go with Sweet Premium Wine, one of my favorite KMD joints, and just a very whimsical, happy time for the author Zev Love X.
Word. And for me, I'm gonna go with Raid from Madvillainy. Just I spent a lot of time with that album over the last week or so, and that one there's so many gems, but like that one is speaking to me today. So Raid is that one. So cool. All right, man. Well, to bigger and brighter days ahead, and yeah, man, looking forward to it.
Absolutely.